Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look at installing the B&W Patriot sliding fifth wheel with the ISR standard rails and custom installation kit on a 2024 Ford F-250. Having a fifth wheel means that, well, you can hook up to your fifth wheel trailer, and there's a ton of different fifth wheels out there, but B&W is one of my personal favorites when it comes to fifth wheels, purely because that's what they know best. They stick to, underbed goosenecks, fifth wheels, and the fifth wheel rails and kits that we installed today. And the quality is fantastic through and through, but first and foremost, making sure that the Patriot's gonna be a good option for you is gonna be important. This is gonna be awesome if you're gonna be towing up to 18,000 pounds, and that's obviously gonna be important, making sure you get the capacity for the trailer that you have. 18,000 pounds should cover a good amount of trailers, but if you're getting pretty heavy duty, you might wanna step up to potentially like the B&W Companion to get a little bit more of that capacity. As far as the vertical load limit on here, we're looking at 4,500 pounds. So heavy duty overall, and there's a lot of good features that really makes this stand out as a great option, and I'm gonna break those down. The slider is going to be great for a short bed truck, and that's what we have here today. If you have a long bed, you really don't need that slider because more times than not, you're going to have extra space in between the cab and the fifth wheel to where you really shouldn't have any issues with tight turns and making contact with your cab corners. But on a short bed, if you're really navigating some tight turns and you're getting close, instead of having to unhitch and then move the truck and then rehook up, you can use the sliding function. You would just hop out of your truck, you pull this handle back, and then as you pull forward, the whole fifth wheel will slide and lock in place. And that's going to change where the kingpin is and allow you to make that sharp turn without any clearance issues. The other thing that really makes this stand out is going to be a 360 wraparound jaw. So when your kingpin is attached, it's got full 360 around it. It's nice and solid, so you'll get a good connection. Some of the more, entry-level fifth wheels are going to be a spring bar and a bar that goes across, and that's just going to really translate to a little bit more movability in the head, which will probably be secure, but it's going to make a lot of jostling and you'll have some chucking. It's just not going to be as smooth of a ride as a 360 wraparound. This one's super easy to use with the handle. It's easily accessible from the outside. You do have this pin that you may have to kind of reach for, but once that pin's out, opens wide up. Once that kingpin comes in, it's going to latch around. You can pin it and then you'll be ready to go. Now, a lot of the fifth wheels out there are going to allow you to pull the head off separate from the base, and that's really nice because this is a lot of weight. They're heavy duty, but to get this back to a truck again means that you're probably going to need an extra set of hands, but being able to remove this head will save a decent amount of weight, making that base a little bit more manageable, and I really like the way that the heads come off of the B&W. You have two really nice touch points on these handles, so as you raise up, it'll automatically unlatch it for you, making it super easy to move. And as we pull this off, you'll see that there's going to be urethane on the arms where they rest, so that's going to translate to quiet and smooth going down the road. Some of the other ones out on the market, it's not going to be, it's metal-to-metal contact, or the connection point has a little bit of urethane or rubber to kind of cut down on that. B&Ws really seem to be one of the more quiet ones out on the road. Now, getting this whole combo kit means that you also get the ISR standard rails in that nice B&W powder coat gray. And that's kind of, ISR standard rails are going to make it to where you can drop in really any fifth wheel. So if you ever needed higher capacity for whatever reason, you could take this out, drop in really almost every major brand of fifth wheel because it is standard. You have openings for all of those. So with that being said, if you need to revert back to a truck to load up some plywood or 2x4s or whatever it may be, to get this whole base out, it's not exactly light because it's a sliding one. None of them are particularly light, but you would just simply unpin, lift this up and out, and then all that's left is those rails, which you are going to gain a little loss of clearance, I suppose, but really nothing too bad. You're still going to be able to slide over, whatever you're putting in the back of the truck. So if you really do need that full bed, you can gain back almost all of it once you have the base out. Now with this combo, I mentioned it's a custom installation kit, and that just simply means that the brackets that bolt up to our rail system is going to be specific to your vehicle. So it's important to make sure you use the fit guide on etrailer.com to make sure you're getting the proper kit. There's probably one for your truck. You just want to make sure that it's going to be the one that's going to bolt up directly. It uses factory spots that are already in the frame rail to bolt that up and make it secure. And the only drilling that's required is going to be the holes to get the hardware through the rails and bolted up underneath. So overall, none of it's terribly hard to do. B&W does a really good job of making a great product with great hardware, but their instructions are also nice. And there's certain things that I really like what B&W does, and it's the little things. So included with this comes a grease packet in one of the instructions, and that's going to make it nice because you're already given the tools to get a long life out of this. They'll show you exactly how to maintain it, and that way you know how to do it long term. Now, if you've made it this far and you're really considering this kit for your vehicle, I highly recommend picking this up. I can't say enough good things about B&W. I think you're going to be really happy with it overall. And in terms of installation, this is one of the better kits out there. I think it's designed really well. Instructions are pretty straightforward, and I'm going to walk you through all the steps to make sure you get it installed in your truck. But if you watch the entire installation and decide maybe this is beyond your scope, maybe you don't have the tools to do it, the place to do it, or even the want to do it, totally fine. That's up to you, but you can reach out to our dealer locator, find someone close to you so you can still get this installed and still be able to tow your fifth wheel down the road. For you DIYers, stick around, I'll walk you through, we'll get this fifth wheel installed. To get started on our installation, I highly recommend getting all your parts laid out, get all your hardware organized. It's going to just make the installation a lot easier. And something you're going to want to grab pretty quickly is going to be the tape that's included, and you may wonder why that's the case. And with Ford moving to aluminum beds, when you have dissimilar metals touching each other, you have potential for galvanic corrosion, and this is just going to create a barrier between the metal of our kit and the aluminum on our bed. So something to keep in mind is anything that's touching raw aluminum, we're going to want to make sure to put this tape in place as a barrier. So that's going to include some of our hardware as we get underneath the truck. And the first thing to get the installation started is going to be getting our rail and establishing exactly where it needs to go for the rear. So we have a spray and bed liner. It's not as crucial because that's going to create the barrier for us, but I'll show you how to get it in place if you don't have a spray and bed liner. So we'll just flip over one of the rails, and we'll take our tape and we're going to run a line on the outside edges as well as the inside edges. So it should be a total of 4 pieces of tape running the entire length. Now once you have your rail prepped with the tape, it should look similar to this. We're going to grab that rail and you're going to want to grab, I'm going to use a chalk marker on our spray and liner. If you have a punch to really get it lined up, that's going to help. But grab your tape measure. That's how we're going to make sure that we get this in the proper spot. And marking that's going to be nice in case it shifts, but we're also going to be making a pilot hole. So first thing, we'll get this in place and start doing some measurements. Now this step is really important to make sure that we get it exactly where we need it to be because it sets the tone for our brackets to bolt up properly and also eventually the forwards rail. So what we'll do is we're going to measure from the end of the bed, and there's measurements in there. Long bed and short bed are going to be the same measurement, and they have 29 3/8. But since we have a spray and liner that does wrap around the edge, generally about 1/8 of an inch tolerance, we'll change that. So what I'm going to do is subtract it, and that way we get the perfect measurement. So that puts us at 29 1/4. So measuring from the back side, I have my rail here. I'm going to just scoot this back and try to align it within the corrugation, and that way you're going to be kind of centered up. We'll do some extra measurements. But that's why a chalk marker comes in place. I'm able to kind of mark everything out and make sure that even if it was to move, we can get those measurements perfectly set up. So you're going to the outside edge of your rail. So get that 29 1/4, measure both sides, and then we're going to measure from the outside. And measuring to get it kind of centered up, best thing is get it pretty close. This center hole should be in the center corrugation. The outside holes should be on the outside edges of the bed corrugation on the raised portions. So just kind of get that set up and then double check your measurements. And that's where the chalk marker, a lot of times I'll put lines across here because as we start to install stuff, we're going to be moving this out to drill out holes. This can shift, and I think it really makes sense to have a nice outline, so even if it does shift slightly, we know exactly where it needs to go. So I'll make those marks now. So I have my chalk lines marked on this front with our measurement. but I'm also going to just kind of go to the end and put this in place. Again, this is a chalk marker, so it'll come off with water, but this will make sure that if it shifts side to side, we can get that visually aligned. We can also put some lines across the back too. But at this point, we're going to need to mark out where we're going to be drilling to get this bolted down. And on this vehicle today, we're going to be using both center holes. So if you have a punch and you don't have a spray and bed liner, that's a great way to make a dimple for our pilot hole. But again, with a spray and bed liner, a lot of times you're not going to be able to see that. So get something visual. So we'll mark those, and then we're going to go to the outside holes, front and back on both sides, and center that up as much as possible. Once you have those marked, you can take your rail and move it out of the way. Now with an 1/8 inch drill bit, we're going to go to each of those 6 holes that we marked out and drill through. This is going to help us when we get underneath with the frame brackets to be able to align that up and make sure that we're centered. So we're not enlarging any of the holes quite yet, but again, this is just going to make sure that we're set up for success for the rest of the installation. Now we're going to head under to get our brackets in place to make sure those holes are aligned exactly where we need them. But throughout the process, you're going to be under the bed for a decent amount of time to get that hardware in place. So I do recommend dropping down your spare tire. You don't have to, but it is definitely going to make this job a lot easier to do. So we'll get ours taken out and moved to the side. Now underneath the truck, we're going to grab the side-specific bracket, and you'll see this one has a D. The other one's a P, so driver passenger, pretty easy. You'll see that there's 2 holes that's going to go towards the cab of the truck. The one single hole is going to go towards the tail. So we're going to put this in place, and we're going to make sure that these align with the factory spots. It should make pretty good sense once you have it against the frame. And what we're going to be looking for is that 1/8 inch hole should align with this or pretty close to it. If it isn't, then we're going to need to make sure that we double check our drill holes and maybe alter that. But assuming we did our measurements up top well, this should work out just fine. So as I hold this up, I'm looking for that pilot hole, lining that up first, and then holding this up against the frame, nice and flush. You should be able to take your fingers and have all of those holes line up. Now, sometimes it'll change on some different chassis or years where you're going to be bolting up, but you should have a good majority of those lining up. And if that's the case, that's a good sign. So check both sides, make sure that everything's aligned properly. Now, with the spare tire out of the way, that definitely makes it a lot easier under here, but as I was putting up the passenger bracket, it's also going to make sense to get this heat shield taken down as well. So there's a bolt on this cross member that we have underneath the bed, or a nut here that we're going to remove, and then there's going to be 2 more back here. So let's just get this heat shield taken down. It looks to be a 13mm socket to accomplish that. Now, seeing that everything lined up with my pilot holes, I'm ready to enlarge these. And so I'm going to come back with a 9/16 drill bit. You can go a little bit larger, and sometimes that actually works out well to give you just a little bit of play for tolerance. But we'll drill these out, the outside ones, we're going to enlarge them. And I recommend having the carriage bolt handy. That way you can test to make sure that it goes through nice and clean, because we'll be cleaning all of this metal shavings up, and it's nice to just get it drilled right the first time. So have that carriage bolt ready. After you drill each one, test to make sure that it goes through smoothly. So it's fairly tight here, so I'm just going to kind of waller that out, just kind of walk the bit, or you can step up to a larger one, but that's going to make it a lot easier for installation. Now on the forward center hole, we're going to do things a little bit different. You can enlarge it to the 9/16, but there's going to be the bed corrugation, the cross member going across, so we need to go all the way through that. And then we're going to enlarge just the top hole because we have this spacer tube, and that's going to sit in place. That way we can get our hardware through, and the bolt will pass through that cross member and we can tighten it up. But this is going to keep it from, really closing up that metal and bending it in the process. So first thing, enlarge this and drill all the way through. Keep it as straight as possible. Now to enlarge this, you're going to want to go up to 7/8. So if you have a large enough drill bit, you can absolutely do that. A step bit is also a good way to do that. And I would recommend having that spacer nearby. That way you can test fit it in. And you'll see that should just kind of rest in here, and then that hole should be directly down, assuming that you drilled nice and straight. So that's what we're looking for. So now I'm going to go through, I'll get all my metal shavings cleared up. Also too, if you do have a spray and bed liner, sometimes you'll have a little bit of flashing of that plastic. So if you want, you can take a file and clean that up. It'll help that hardware pass through a little bit better. With an aluminum bed, you really don't have to worry about the raw metal turning into rust long term, but just for corrosion's sake and having hardware in place, just to kind of help protect that, I'm taking a paint marker and just kind of marking up those raw edges where we drilled. You don't have to use a paint marker. You could use a spray paint and just kind of spray it in there. But again, this is just going to help kind of create that barrier between the aluminum and our steel hardware. So now we're going to get our brackets in place, driver and passenger side. And the first one we'll do is the driver's side. So get your hardware set up. You're going to have these large bolts with the 2 large washers, a split washer and a nut, and we're going to have 2 of those combos. Now, again, talking about that galvanic corrosion, we're going to want to put a little bit of strip of tape along this edge as it's going to be sitting against the bed. So if you haven't done that already, by all means, you can go ahead and do that. And we also have the passenger side set up. We're going to be doing the same thing. So if you want to get the hardware set up for that at the same time, you're going to have 2 of the same bolts, split washer and nut combos. You should have 3 flat washers, the larger ones. There's this offset hole spacer as well as a large rectangular spacer. So if you want to get that set up side to side, that's going to make it a lot easier getting this in place. But first, we'll get our tape put in place. I have the strip of tape on the outside edges, and generally you can go to the wheel wells to get this in place. And right now I just have the bolt and the flat washer. We're going to pass that through the factory spot to hold this in place, and then we can finish up on the back side with the rest of the hardware. And depending on the year of truck is going to depend where these bolt holes go. On ours today, being a 24, we're going to be using the 2 center holes. So get this lined up. Again, using that back hole to kind of get you close to that pilot hole that we drilled. And then with those passed in, that's going to hold that in place. So now we can head underneath and just get our rest of the hardware started, just hand tight. So just make sure you have the flat washer, split washer, and then the nut. And again, we're just going to be hand tightening here just to hold everything in place. We'll tighten everything a little bit later when we have everything lined up. But for now, this will do it for us. Passenger side is going to be very similar. We're going to be using the more middle hole of the 2 here, and then this square section is going to get a little bit different. So on this one, pretty easy, just the flat washer and bolt like we did on the driver's side. On the passenger side, we'll have this spacer, and that's going to go into an inset that's, this is going to offset it to where we can get that bolt through. So we're going to want to make sure we get that in the proper spot. So we'll get the first one in. But with this one, we're going to be putting that offset in place and then passing the bolt through with that large spacer to kind of cover all that up once it's tightened. So just make sure that you have this orientation. And that's going to hold that in place. And then you can take that offset spacer and figure out which way you need to go. That looks good. So now we can get our bolt with that large spacer block in place. And then we'll go on the inside, and we're going to finish it up with the same combo we did on the other side. So flat washer, split washer, and nut. Again, just hand tight. And with the brackets loosely in place, we can get our rail put back in right over where we drilled those holes. And the hardware is going to be a little bit unique. It's going to change kind of throughout. So make sure that you're putting these in the proper orientation. If you haven't already put that pipe spacer in place, you can go ahead and do that. And that's going to take the large carriage bolt. But as we drop this through, any place where the corrugation drops down, we're going to be using these U-shaped spacers. So whether it's on the top of the truck or the bottom, we want to make sure we're not crushing the corrugation when we later tighten down the hardware. So I'll get this aligned. I'll take my large carriage bolt and pass that through. Make sure it does pass through that cross member as well. And then take your U-shaped spacer, and that's going to go in between that corrugation. Now, again, if you do have the spray and bed liner, it's not as important to get that tape on there. But if it is just raw aluminum, make sure that you are putting the tape on those spacers where it's going to make contact with the aluminum. So we have that one in place. Our forwardmost holes towards the cab of the truck, it's going to be these bolts with split washers, and this is going to later get bolted up to kind of the handle nuts or the weld nut spacers. So eventually we'll thread these in, but that's why they're a little bit different. Since it's on the top part of the corrugation, no need to worry about the U-shaped spacer up top. We will have 3 carriage bolts. So the outside ones, again, no spacer required. This is a good time if you're fighting it. If you need to go and enlarge those holes a little bit, you can absolutely do that, but we should have everything pretty well dialed in to where it drops in. And then our center one, again, this is going to be a carriage bolt, but make sure you put that spacer in place. Now, if they don't all completely drop in all the way, sometimes the buildup of powder coat where the square opening of the carriage bolt is will cause that to just kind of bind up. A lot of times if you just give it a quick pop, it should drop in place. But also on these outside ones, it's very possible that bracket might be just off kilter to where it's catching. So as long as you have them kind of dropped in place, we can get those dialed in later or enlarge that hole if we absolutely have to. But they should go into place. It's mostly important to get these cap screws dropped down because the next step is going to be getting those bolted up. Now for this step, we're going to be doing it on both sides, and it's a little bit unique. You're going to have this nut that's welded onto a U-shaped spacer. Again, I put the tape on this where it's going to make contact, and we have a special tool from B&W. Makes it really easy. You'll see the wedge here. We're going to put it in this configuration, and if you need to put bends on here, you can absolutely do that. So I have an assistant, Beth, she's helping me today, and you're going to probably need an extra set of hands for this because as you put this in place, you're going to want to align that bolt and then raise this up, and then whoever your assistant is in the bed, just have them get a few threads started. It's not that difficult, but it's really hard to do by yourself. And where we're going to be placing this is in this corrugation. It's hard to see because of this portion hanging down, but the thread of the bolt is a little bit ways up here, so that's why putting a bend on that handle is going to be helpful. And the best way I found is if you put this past it and then drag it back to where that U-shaped spacer catches the threads, you can then kind of raise that up and then get those threaded in place. So I'll get this raised up and then have the assistant just start tightening that down. And once you get a few threads started, you'll be good to go. Now, it isn't terribly difficult. It's just kind of unique. It's hard to see. So as far as bend, I kind of end up something with this, and I just kind of pried it to where it was straight up to where that bolt can thread. I had Beth using a 3/4 inch socket and just rotate that around until it catches on both sides. You don't have to crank it down, just make sure that it's threaded on there properly. And at this point, we can head underneath the truck where we're going to get some of our other hardware bolted up. To get the bottom side bolted up, the first two that we're going to tackle are going to be that large carriage bolt that we ran through the corrugation or this cross member, and then the one that's going to be a little bit further back. We're going to be taking our rectangle spacers. You can see I already have the tape on there, and we're going to put that in place, followed by a flat washer, a split washer, and then a nut. and just hand tight this for now. We're going to do the same thing for this bolt. Now, the rear bolts are going to be a little bit different just because we have that corrugation going up. So we'll take the U-shaped spacer and make sure that you put the tape on there facing the bed. That'll slide in place. And again, this is just so when we tighten it all down, it's not crushing that down. Once you get the U-shaped spacer in place, it's going to be similar. You don't have to tape it because it's going to, or the rectangle spacer doesn't need to be taped because that's going to be resting against the B&W portion. So same thing, flat washer, split washer, and nut. Now, if you're having trouble threading, that's very possible. Sometimes it might be better to just omit one of the washers to snug this down. That should draw that carriage bolt in. And that's why it's important sometimes to pop that head down and make sure that it's seated. Because even right now, I'm struggling to get a little bit of thread started at all. So if you have someone, that extra set of hands that could kind of push that down while you do that, great. If not, you can use this and this will help draw it down. Now I am going to go back eventually and get that split washer in place, but this will help draw everything into place. Now I mentioned to get this started, I removed the split washer. You can actually take off the flat washer to get that started. And if it is impossible to get that started with the flat washer, you can omit this. It's okay. They say to do that in the instructions. And I found on both sides that was the case. Now to get the forward rail mounted up, we're going to be using the Patriot base. So you're going to want that extra set of hands to lift that in place. And we're going to put our other rail already taped up here, just kind of roughly where that base should sit. Because as you're lifting it in, you're going to drop it into this base, and then we're going to drop it into here, and that's going to give us those markings. There's a few steps in between there, but the main thing is getting that base in our ISR rails. Kevin's going to help me drop this in place. So as we move it forward, we'll get that rear towards the tailgate in. And then I'll just raise up the front here until we can get it to drop into those rails. So with this in place, we do need to get this centered up. So best thing I would say is it's going to pretty well align with the other one. So get that center hole lined up, as well as these on the corrugation on the outside. And you'll have a little bit of side-to-side movement that you see here. So really get that centered. But also, as we drop this in, we want to make sure that it's going to drop in nice and easy each time. And the best way to get this all aligned is to be pulling this rail towards the front of the truck and pulling the base back. So you may need an extra set of hands here, but a lot of times I can kind of shift it. And that's going to allow it to, again, just drop in and be cohesive across the whole way. If you need to, you can measure on the sides. But once we have this in place, we can start making our marks to where we're going to drill our pilot holes. And once you're happy with the placement, we're going to be marking the same holes on the outside. And when it gets to the center portion, we're going to omit the one that's towards the rear. We're only going to be doing this front one. And if you want to, you can raise everything out, and everything should be aligned here, so that way it'll make it easier to get those pilot holes drilled through. And this is going to be the same process as we drilled out previous. I'm going to do my pilot holes and then go back and enlarge them and then test to make sure that my carriage bolt will be able to pass through. Now, just as before, we're following essentially the same thing. So because we have that drop-down corrugation on this center bolt, make sure you put the U-shaped spacer. And with these, sometimes, again, as I mentioned, that powder coat, just take a dead blow, knock those down, because you're going to want all of those threads to be able to get that hardware started. It's going to make it a lot easier than having to jump back up here to do that. Speaking of, I've knocked those down. We're going to head underneath and get everything bolted up. It's going to be very similar to the other rail, so we're in the home stretch. So again, very similar to the backside. We have our studs that are down here, but the corrugation does go up. So in order to get these U-shaped bolts, it's actually a little bit easier to go from the inside and then pass them straight out. You're then going to just finish it up with that same combo of hardware. So that washer, or the rectangle plate, a flat washer, split washer, and nut. So we'll get all of those in place. The center is also going to be the same as we did on the others. So just get all your hardware, hand tighten. Now it's time to go back and torque them all down. Now the torque settings are going to change between the different sizes of bolts, but all of this hardware that's holding the rails in place, that's going to be vertical, you can use the same 3/4 inch socket and the same torque setting. As we get to the larger bolts, we're going to have to grab a wrench, and I believe that to be a larger socket as well. But first things first, let's get this hardware torqued down. This is going to be important because you're going to be towing a lot of weight with this, and you want to make sure that long term it's not going to become loose or over tightened. And this is a great way to make sure that that's going to be perfectly dialed in. So we'll go through and get all of our rail bolts properly torqued. Once you get all the rail bolts tightened down and torqued, make sure that you're getting those bolts that go into those blocks that we fed in as well. Now we can do the frame bolts. And traditionally I like to use the torque wrench on the nut side. If you can do that, by all means, but it does get pretty tight in some of these sections. And also you're going to want a 15/16 wrench on the other side that you're torquing, because otherwise it's just going to spin. So I've found a lot of times on these, I am going to be using the bolt head to torque down, but with a long extension, I'm able to get it right outside the tire, because otherwise it's fairly high torque setting. Really trying to do this can be tricky, but again, you do want to make sure that it's properly torqued. Now, before we start assembling the Patriot, something I'd recommend, it's the first time that this has really been in the rails, and if you ever try to take them out, sometimes these can bind up pretty good. So lift up the front. It should raise out fairly easily. If you're having to use a pry bar to get this to pry out, I would suggest you could drop it in a few times, and that might knock some of that powder coat loose, or you can start to loosen some of that hardware that you torque down, shift it as necessary, and then re-torque. But hopefully you did it all right to where it should be fairly easy to drop in place. So at this point, we're going to get the rest of the fifth wheel set up. It's really easy to do. If you want to, you might want to measure your camper at the kingpin to make sure that you're getting as level as possible. Generally here we set them up kind of mid-range, and then you can adjust from there, and that's what I'm going to do with this one. So you're going to want to grab each of the arms for each side. This is where our head is going to rest, and we're going to get our bolts, which is going to be just this hardware with split washers. And it's also a good time to check to make sure that your pins go through, so they should just pass in fairly easily, and then you can put a cotter pin on them. Again, sometimes tolerances will make this a little bit difficult, but we'll see if we can't get this to fit through. Now, when getting these arms in place, you do have some adjustability. Not only height, but also the way that you position it will change where the head's going to rest. Being that this is a short bed truck and a slider, I'm going to put it to where the head's going to be a little bit further back to give us a little bit more clearance, and that way maybe we can omit having to use the slider as much. And I'm going to go mid-height. So we're going to use the center holes, and we're going to get those bolts in place. I'm just going to thread them in by hand. And we're going to just mirror it on the other side. Now we are going to be torquing these down, but to speed up that process, we can snug them down. If you have a 3/4 inch socket, you can go ahead and tighten them down. Once you're happy with the setup as far as height and you got the position set up, now we just need to torque down that hardware. 3/4 inch socket, torque settings are going to be found in the instruction manual. Now you're going to want to grab your spring clip, the spring, and the hardware that's with it. This is going to make sure that our head is going to spring in place and keep it to where it's going to center up when you go to load. So pretty easy here. We're just going to run our bolt through. This portion of that arm should be here, so it's not going to rotate. So just kind of get it in this orientation, and then we'll get the nut started. And we're going to tighten this down. You can use a 7/16, 11 millimeter also works here. You don't need to get crazy, but get this snug down. To get this set up, you're going to want to go to the driver's side towards the cab, and that's where we're going to attach it to our arm. 1/2 inch from the top of this spring portion to the top of the rubber is kind of what we're looking for. Generally a finger width, give or take, is good. And having this all assembled makes it easier to get this hammered on. It is not super easy to do. Sometimes I've ended up having to pry this open to get it started. Once you get it to bite on one corner, hammer will really do the rest of it. So just take your time here, and we'll get this in place. So you can see that corner is already starting to detach. That should make it really easy to get the rest of it. Now before you put the head on, you can grab the grease that's included in the instruction manual and get your urethane spots there. We'll drop this on. Now we need to get our latch handle assembled, and this is going to be pretty easy. You'll see that there's 3 holes. The center one is for the locking pin. So we'll open this up. If you want, you can slide this back, and we're going to pass our button head screws down. And then we have our flange nuts. Those are going to go on the bottom. We'll just get those started by hand for now. Now to get this tightened down, a 9/16 socket on the nut, and then a 7/32 hex on that button head. We'll just get this all tightened down. Now with the handle on, everything's ready to go. So if you're hooking up to your trailer right away, you can leave this open, get your kingpin attached, and then latch this down. But if you're not ready to tow right away, you'll be ready to because you have everything installed. And this is going to be a great setup. The only other thing that I might recommend that you might pick up at the same time and install is going to be in-bed wiring. We're going to be doing that on this truck. For any fifth wheel, it makes a lot of sense to be able to plug in that 7-way into the bed rather than drape it over the tailgate. Other than that, this is a great option. You're going to be really happy with it. And as you saw, the installation's not terribly hard to do. Now also make sure that you have your spare tire and heat shield put back in place. Then all that's left to do is load up your fifth wheel and hit the road. Now if you've owned the Patriot or this kit, or you're looking to buy it, when you do purchase it, or if you've lived with it, please leave a review, a comment, a picture. That really helps us really make the best videos possible for neighbors like you to make sure that you're getting the best product possible when searching. My name's Brad at eTrailer. Thanks for watching.